When Stephanie Malia Krauss began writing her new book, Whole Child, Whole Life, she was in the middle of a Zoom tour to promote her first book, Making It: What Today's Kids Need for Tomorrow's World. That's because Making It ended up getting released during the height of the pandemic.
I'm a mom of two. And in the pandemic, one of my children was having a really serious mental health challenge.
So Stephanie, who is also a teacher, former school director, and social worker, did what any caregiver would do. She began looking for something, anything, that would help her figure out what to do.
What I was hearing from these teachers and parents and coaches was what I was feeling in my bones. So I went out and I tried to find, is there a book that is kind of a one-stop resource for all of the cross-training we need? And I couldn't find it, and so I wrote it.
The guidebook she created, Whole Child, Whole Life, is filled with time-tested strategies and resources to help kids live, learn, and thrive. Illustrations by artist Manuel S. Herrera bring those lessons to life. But for Stephanie, a native Hawaiian who lives in the St. Louis area with her family, Whole Child, Whole Life is also a living reminder of how volatile the world has become. In October of 2022, her godson was hit by gunfire during the deadly school shooting at Central Visual and Performing Arts High School that killed another student and a teacher.
He was one of the students who was shot. And so we went through the pandemic, and then we survived this brutal school shooting. I was just in Hawaii when the wildfires happened, and then all of the other things. So I've done that grief work and then become resolute that it must still be possible to protect childhood and to give these kids good lives, that we, the adults, deserve to have this information because our kids deserve to have good lives.
Stephanie Malia Krauss, thank you so much for joining us.
I am so glad to be with you and to be together in person.
I know, I feel like I've met you before, but it was on Zoom, so.
It was the height of the pandemic through those screens before we had all of the tricks of the trade of the lighting and everything else. We were still figuring out life in the pandemic.
So your new book is Whole Child, Whole Life, 10 Ways to Help Kids Live, Learn, and Thrive.
So it officially came out with the publisher at the very end of May, and it was one of the first books written in response to the youth mental health crisis. And we were all shocked when it immediately sold out of all outlets. So it has been launching and coming out across the whole summer, and by the end of summer became a bestseller.
Wow. Why did you write this?
So when we were together in the middle of the pandemic, we were talking because I had a book that had come out called Making It: What Today's Kids Need for Tomorrow's World. And the focus of that book, as you might remember, was how much the world is changing, and that graduating from high school is not the same thing as being ready for adulthood, especially not an adulthood that's shaped by volatility and disruption and changes in the workplace. And so the book comes out, the height of the pandemic. I'm doing this basement book tour, and people would see that I had a social work background. And inevitably, almost every single time, if I was speaking to people who were caring for kids, working with kids, raising kids, parents, coaches, counselors, someone would say on the Zoom screen, on that bingo board, it's really interesting what kids need for the future, but I'm worried that my kid's not going to get there, that they're going to burn out or give up, or something is going to happen before they get into adulthood. What do they need right now? And I'm a mom of two. And in the pandemic, one of my children was having a really serious mental health challenge. I write about it in the book. And even though I'm a social worker, married to a social worker, we were struggling with not only what he was going through right now, but what it was going to mean for the rest of his life. And of course, the pandemic was a deeply traumatizing experience. And we were looking at all of the other things that were happening in the world at the time: racial violence, political volatility, not knowing, just the uncertainty of it all. And And I realized, Brenda, that I am in community amazingly with some of the wisest experts and change makers who know all about the health of kids, the development of kids, social work, counseling, and also the science of learning and development. And what I was hearing from these teachers and parents and coaches was what I was feeling in my bones. So I went out and I tried to find, is there a book that is kind of a one-stop resource for all of the cross-training we need, and how do we take care of kids now, and what will they need now and in the future to be healthy and happy and whole? And I couldn't find it, and so I wrote it.
Where did you start when you realized that this book was needed?
So if I go back in my mind, this book was written rapidly. So where Making It took 2 years, Whole Child, Whole Life was 8 months of just writing as fast as I could. And the first thing that I did is I have, for the entirety of my career, focused on what young people need to be ready and child and youth well-being and justice. And so there was a lot of research that I already had in my head from my background in education and youth development. And so the very first thing I did actually maybe is not typical of authors. I wrote kind of a straw man of what are the practices that feel really timely, but also timeless, that work across contexts. Because what was really important to me was, if I was going to write a book about what kids need to be healthy and whole, was it going to hold for any kid, no matter what they look like, no matter where they're from, no matter what they're going through? And so I had that list of practices, and then I reached out to probably 10 to 15 of the smartest national global leaders I knew in child well-being, in child rights, in social work, in youth development, and said, will you get on the phone with me and just look at this list? And what ended up being the result was the core of the book, which are these 10 proven practices that we as adults need to do to support kids, like building community and belonging. But eventually it becomes the internalized practice of a young person as they move forward in life. How do I build community and belonging in my own life that supports not only reducing problems in your life, but actually promotes good thriving?
So it's sort of taking that same approach that you take with this curriculum subject and saying, I'm teaching you this now so that you're ready for the next stage.
That's exactly right. So I used to be a teacher and I ran a school, and the goal for every lesson was, I'm going to teach you this thing, and then we're going to do it together. And then eventually you're going to have enough mastery over it that you'll be able to do it yourself.
You mentioned spirituality in your list of 10, and that's, I think, a really great thing that's in there, because I do feel like that's a topic a lot of people don't really know how to talk about or want to address, and that it doesn't necessarily need to be tied to organized religion, but that there is sort of a bit of a crisis of faith among young people.
This was the hardest chapter for me to write, and I am a person who has a spiritual life. But I wrote the book for anybody who works with kids and anybody who raises kids. And so I knew it was a book that would be in public schools. I knew it was a book that would be in youth organization, boys and girls clubs, YMCAs, those kinds of places. And very often spirituality is not a welcome part of that conversation, right? We keep religion out of public schools and those pieces. And yet,
it's a loaded subject for a lot of people.
The science on what kids need to live and to thrive irrevocably points to this natural wiring we have to ask, am I a part of something bigger? Is there something out there? And is there a reason for this? And the research on spirituality is amazing. Their imaginations are so big. And in adults, what the science shows is that when somebody has a really vibrant spiritual life, and when they can experience awe and wonder that it is the most protective factor against adversity and trauma and stress and grief. And if we can just nourish that across their life and keep sort of, tending that fire, that is what we're going after.
I think as a parent, I feel like one of the things I really saw in the pandemic was exposed so many cracks that were there that we didn't want to look at, and then we couldn't look away.
Absolutely. When we experienced the pandemic, you had universal trauma. Then you had age-old historic trauma. We've always struggled with abuse and neglect and addiction and those pieces. But the pressure of the conditions brought on by the pandemic inflamed so many conditions that kids who were already vulnerable and wounded, who were already struggling, often things got so much harder. And kids who may not have struggled were suddenly struggling. And for us as adults, we were struggling too, and didn't always have the capacity or resources or skills in how to support our kids while we were trying to figure out how to support ourselves and our families overall.
You wrote this for a broad audience, but also for very specific reasons for each member of that audience. Tell us who you really wrote this for.
So this book is written for anybody who is working with or raising kids right now and really wanting to get into their hands all of the research and resources that cross-train them in pediatric and adolescent health, child and youth development, the science of learning, the science of flourishing, and well-being. All of the things we know across those pieces. When I imagine the sort of like beauty of this coming alive, I think about a kid who has a pediatrician, a teacher, a counselor, a sports coach, and a parent who all have this information, and what it would look like if that collection of adults who surround a child were all operating from a space of what does this kid need to thrive, and how do I get to know the whole of who they are? Very often you read education books that talk about children as students, and there's something from my perspective that's a little reductionistic about this. Like the way I think about it, Brenda, would be if my child went to his teacher, Miss Dawson, who we love, who my older son talks about in the preface of the book, and said, Miss Dawson, I want to tell you what I did this weekend. And she were to say to him, sweetheart, you're just my student. Like, we only talk about school things here. It would crush his little heart. And I think we have all of these adults who are constantly collectively raising these kids, and they should all be equipped with some common knowledge about not only what that takes, but what that takes in this particularly complex time in history.
You are so uniquely positioned to write this because you have actually been all of those things. You're a social worker, teacher, you've been a student, you've been a child, you've been a parent, you ran a school.
Yeah, a sports coach, right? I think I've been the parent of youth athletes. Let's talk about like sports coaches for a second. Mostly volunteer parents who do not get trained in child and youth development before they are with our kids for hours a week. So whether we are working with kids and getting paid for it or not, whether we are a grandparent or a parent, like a kind neighbor. I had a lot of neighbors raising me when I was growing up. It is that collective care piece. It is how do we all get ourselves educated on the science and art of what it takes to raise kids and what it takes to raise kids right now so that they can have a good life and so that they can be good humans.
Just looking at your background, you were the child in trouble and you were the adult there to help other children in trouble. That must have been really interesting process to have those different perspectives filtered into writing this guide.
Mm-hmm. Amazingly. So a little bit about my background is the last year of school that I had was the 8th grade. GED recipient, started at community college, worked my way up. I got sober when I was 15. So yeah, it was a really complicated childhood. But there is something incredibly healing for me as I was writing this, and I actually got to take a trip back to my hometown at the same time. So I'm one of 5 kids. And when I ended up moving out of town, I was only 16, which let me tell you, like as a mom of tweens and teens now, I'm like, oh, I was such a baby. I was so young, like off on my own, thinking I was so grown and had experienced so much life. But when I left home, felt like there was so much I didn't have. And yet somehow I had enough that when I left at 16, I made it. And I built this incredible life for myself. And so as I was writing the book, I started to see where these practices were present. So, for example, I started working at a way too early age at a local restaurant. They let me work. The police in town knew, the people in town knew, everybody let me work. And those guys raised me. And they were community and belonging. And they were healthy relationships. They weren't the school. They weren't my house. But they were an intense part of my life. And so what I learned was, and this is, I think, where there's a lot of grace and power. We as adults don't need to do everything in this book perfectly. We should use it as kind of a daily, regular inventory of, do I know these 10 practices? If something is going on, where are the soft spots for the kid? Is it an issue with spirituality? Is it an issue with healthy relationships? Is it an issue with mental health? What supports do they need? But what these kids need is a community of people who are rallying around them, a web of support where across the spaces and places where they spend time, these things are present.
I was talking with a friend about this a couple of days ago because I don't think we've realized how much things did change, because I grew up in the same way, in that it was adults. There were a lot of adults sort of in the wings, sort of watching out for everyone's children in a way that they could, whatever way they could. Somehow that started to change. And I think now we're feeling that profound result.
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is a book about wholeness. And it's a book about human-centeredness. And I think one of the things that points out to me is the need to humanize our adult-to-adult interactions. I could go through
relationships.
Yeah, I could, let's just look at my own kids. I could only communicate with my boys' teachers via app and never see them in person. I could only drop my kids off at baseball and soccer practice and never interact with their coach. I could only talk to the receptionist at the pediatrician's office and never get on the phone with the pediatrician, let alone these people talk to each other. And so there is work to do, because we're all making decisions about one kid with partial knowledge of who they are and what they need. And so a lot of this work is, you're right, there has been the deterioration of that, that village effect. Yeah. Right. And so it does exist in places, and we can really just do the nourishing and nurturing of that. But the adult to adult piece of this is a really important part.
I think another thing that's changed is the shifting role and expectations for teachers.
So when I was going through my education schooling, I received training on classroom management, classroom culture, and content delivery. I never had a class in pediatric and adolescent health. I never had a class in mental health first aid, in trauma-informed care, in any of those pieces. And yet, this group I had 37 students my first year teaching. all of these kids were coming in with all their stuff. And life was happening in my classroom. We were together for hours together every day. So I think there needs to be this shift of paradigm of how do we support the real need for more mental health professionals in our schools and in our communities, because the reality is that the need of mental health challenge among kids is exceeding the number of clinicians we have available to serve them. Kids who need help are ending up in emergency rooms for hours. They're ending up on waiting lists, sometimes for 2 or 3 years. So this is an all hands on deck, right? Like that's why I have a chapter on prioritizing mental health specifically, because any adult who is with a child for any period of time needs base level training, just like we get trained in first aid or CPR. But the real kind of reorienting is if you're in a room with a group of children who are in your care for hours each week, each day, you deserve the training to know how to handle the situations that might show up in those moments.
How did writing this book change you?
It has been a hard year for my family. We almost lost my godson to the school shooting at Central Visual and Performing Arts High School. He was one of the students who was shot. And so we went through the pandemic, and then we survived this brutal school shooting. I was just in Hawaii when the wildfires happened, and then all of the other things. And so you have these big sort of capital T traumas, and then the everyday that continue on. The events might be done, but the impacts of it are not. And so I think where this book has impacted me so much is showing up actually in the launch of it, that in writing this book in a time when, so the chapter on Forces for Good, the day that the shooting happened, I was supposed to interview a survivor from Parkland to talk about how he and his classmates did the March for Our Lives. And instead, I was canceling my interview with him because I was flying home to get to St. Louis. I was out of town because of the shooting. I mean, the impact of that. And my son wrote the preface, and he talks about that reality of his lived experience of what he has survived and gone through, what all of these kids have survived and gone through. And so I think that I have done the grief work of realizing that the lived experience of children right now is fundamentally different from ours. Even with the challenges in my childhood, I did not experience the pressures that kids have gone through and endured today. I cannot imagine what it would have been to have my childhood and then have my childhood in today's environment. So I've done that grief work and then become resolute that it must still be possible to protect childhood and to give these kids good lives. And so I think it has come out, Brenda, in the promotion of the book of actually believing with the fullness of who I am, that we, the adults, deserve to have this information because our kids deserve to have good lives.
The last item on your list of 10 is helping children find a way to see and embrace wonder and awe. Mm-hmm. Why was that so important to end it that way?
When we can experience beauty, when we can see the world as wondrous and worth being in and fighting for, it takes the crushing feeling that life is happening to us, and it gives space and energy for coming together and continuing forward. And that's the kind of strength that kids need. They deserve to see the world as beautiful. And for us as parents, it is as much as when I was writing that chapter, my kids and I were in the car and we drove past one of those scenic points. And I realized never in my life have I pulled over. I'm always on the rush. I'm always late. Like, we gotta go, right? Like, we're not gonna make it. And Brenda, I pulled over the car and I was like, let's see this scenic overlook, right? And it was beautiful. I would have missed it. And they would have missed it. And I would have missed that moment with them. And that's what we all need more of.
Stephanie Malia Krauss, thank you so much for joining us. It has been so great to talk to you.
It's been great to be back with you. Thanks for having me, and thanks for talking about whole child, whole life.